Okay, let's go ahead and begin. Last week, I was looking at page 39, and I was not able to understand what Levis was talking about. And so, I went to Aula and discussed the next few pages with him. I was actually hoping he would say, let's give up this book. Let's change it. We'll go to something different. But he is very excited about the content. And I find myself wishing he were teaching you this, because it is so rich to discuss the book with Aula. What I receive from discussing the book with Aula is so good and so valuable. I wish you could have that, but he doesn't have time to teach this book. That is why he wants you to read it, and he wants me to help you read it. So, I am going to try to share with you the extra content that Aula gave me. I think what I say will be familiar to you. He has spoken of these concepts in his classes, and you probably have more background to understand these concepts than I do. So maybe what I say will be familiar. Maybe it will evoke new ideas in you, and that will be better than if you just read the book on your own. And of course, if there is a phrase or a word, vocabulary, or a construction grammatically that you don't understand, you can send it to me by text or by email and get a quick answer. So in that sense, this will help you. But we're going to go over the same material today that we went over last week, and hopefully move on into the new material that we didn't consider last week on page 40 and 41. So, let us begin on page 39, first full paragraph at the top, beginning with the words, Polanyi as an epistemologist. Okay? I'll read the paragraph, but then I'm going to break everything into thought units without respect to paragraphing, and talk about it in the way that Aula talked about it with me a few days ago. Okay? Let me know if there's any problem hearing me. I know my voice isn't good today. Okay, first we'll read. Polanyi, as an epistemologist, insists that what for philosophers is mind is there only in individual minds, and that an individual mind is always a person's, and a person has a body and history. His mind is the mind of his body, and his body is the body of his mind. The dualism that has defeated so many epistemologies is eliminated here. I'd like to stop there and talk about that little chunk. Apparently, according to Aula, and I'm sure you know, there is a broad pattern within the Cartesian tradition of thought, whereby certain characteristics are abstracted from a whole, and then the abstraction is taken as the thing itself. The abstraction might be a mathematical model, or it might be the measurements of the physical specimen, or the density, or the mass. Some abstraction of an object is taken, and then the rest of it is thrown away. They deal only with the ideal, the mathematical model. In the case of a person, we, in our civilization, coming out of the Cartesian tradition, are very comfortable seeing people as a union of mind and body. And if you abstract the mind from the body, the Cartesian believes you can deal with it as the subject in itself. You can isolate the mind from the body with all of its traditions, its physical reaction to time, its physical sensations, its perceptive capabilities, its relational capabilities, and its ability to learn. All that is part of the body. You abstract mind and take it as though it were a clean slate. Mind is a thinking substance. Now, most of us come out of this broad Cartesian influence over our thinking, and we're very comfortable with this mind-body dualism. But Polanyi rejected that. He, as a scientist, not from a literary standpoint, not even really from a philosophical standpoint, but he, with his scientific approach, insisted that this mind-body distinction was flawed. It was nonsensical. The fact is, a mind is never abstracted from a body. It is never in isolation from the body. It is not a pure entity. And to deal with it as though it were is reductionist. I looked up the definition of the word reductionist, and it means to make something so simple, to reduce a complex thing so much that you have actually changed its nature. What you are describing is not consistent with the original. So in other words, to consider a mind in isolation as abstracted from the person and as separated from the body is to create distortion and is to misunderstand the character of mind. So Polanyi insists that we reunite mind and body, that we recognize and deal with the fact that a mind is contained in a physical organism, that a mind is influenced by context. A mind learns from outside sources. It does not originate all of its own ideas. A mind follows a track that is given to it by the outside world. And a mind is not separated from a body, ever. So, Polanyi, as an epistemologist, concerned with how we know what we know, begins with the insistence that mind is inextricable from body. And the best construct for talking about mind, if you want to construct something that you can accurately talk about, that represents mind, the best construct would be person. Because person has complexity, layers of reality, context in the physical world, context relationally, context in time. So, first point is Polanyi's insistence that we recognize the Cartesian influence in our thinking and debunk the Cartesian dualism of mind-body and put them back together in our thinking. So we'll move on now. I'm beginning in the middle of the paragraph with the sentence beginning with the words "for Polanyi enforces." Okay? For Polanyi enforces this insistence in an account of knowing, thinking, and discovering, in which he emphasizes the tacit element in these and makes it plain that they could not have been at all if mind had not been the mind of a body, since on the un-Cartesian actuality this last formulation points to depends the essential part in them played by the tacit, depends the process by which we acquire knowledge that we cannot tell, which is essential even to a trained sociologist's thinking. I pay due respect to Andreski when I say that I cannot believe that, if relaxing his Cartesian certitude, he had really read the two essays to which I referred, he would have been able to dispute with confidence this conclusion. All knowledge falls into one of these two categories. It is either tacit or rooted in tacit knowledge. Okay. First I want to point out that this section describes how Polanyi supports his insistence that mind and body are inseparable. He supports it by pointing out that in knowing, thinking, and discovering, in knowing, thinking, and discovering, there is a tacit element which is fundamental and essential to the process. Now, we pointed out last week that tacit is defined in the paragraph as that which we know but cannot tell. Most people aren't actively aware of what is tacit in their knowledge. For example, if you go to take a test and you have studied a sheet with certain facts. You have memorized certain dates, certain concepts, certain names. You know explicitly that this information is memorized and you have it. And if the questions on the test are, what year was the Declaration of Independence signed in the United States? 1776. If the question explicitly asks for that information, you know it. This is explicit knowledge. But if the questions are thought questions, such as, why do you think the colonists in North America created a Declaration of Independence and fought a war to establish a new political structure which had never been tried before? Then you might have to draw upon knowledge which is in you that you didn't know you had, perhaps. You might have to dig deep and think creatively and bring in psychological knowledge, bring in little pieces of history that you remember, bring in little snatches of understanding of politics and political history. And you might have to make a statement of opinion that you had never read before, based on all of these little snippets of information. You are drawing on a huge body of tacit knowledge, knowledge which is available but not explicit in your mind. The amount of knowledge that is tacit within a person is much greater than the amount that is explicit. Olavo made the comment about literary language, poetic language. He said, poetic language has the characteristic that it can evoke tacit knowledge in the reader. And the circle of evoked knowledge is much greater than the circle of explicit meaning in a poem. So a person is a universe of tacit knowledge in which float specific bits of explicit knowledge. The medium is tacit. The particles are explicit. So, Polanyi explains knowing, thinking, and discovering by pointing out that the tacit element is key and indispensable. Indispensable means you cannot have the process without the tacit element. Olavo gave me an example. He said, all language requires context to have meaning. He said a simple sentence like, give me the pen, will have no meaning without context. He said, if a person says, give me the pen, they assume that you know where you are, where I am, where the pen is, which pen it is, what is a pen, and what does it mean to give as opposed to sell or to throw or something else, or to lend. So, without the physical context of location and reference, give me the pen has no meaning. So, these processes cannot take place without a large component that is tacit and not explicit. Okay, I'm going to read this little section again because I also want to look at the structure from an English language point of view and show you a little bit of how it is constructed because it's complicated. So let's read it again. For Polanyi enforces this insistence, remember the insistence of reuniting mind and body, in an account of knowing, thinking, and discovering, an account being a description of the process, in which he emphasizes the tacit element in these, and makes it plain that they could not have been at all if mind had not been the mind of a body, mind in context. Since on the un-Cartesian actuality this last formulation points to depends the essential part in them, played by the tacit. Okay, that's where the difficulty in grammar comes in. This phrase, since on the un-Cartesian actuality this last formulation points to. This last formulation points to. The formulation is the formulation that mind is part of body. That is un-Cartesian. The un-Cartesian actuality that mind is part of body. On that idea depends the essential part in these played by the tacit. So what it's saying is, if mind was not the mind of a body, then the tacit element wouldn't matter. But because mind is part of a body, then the tacit element matters. It depends on it. And the process by which we acquire knowledge that we cannot tell depends on the un-Cartesian actuality that this formulation points to. I find this a very difficult paragraph, grammatically. But I think we've gotten the idea that Polanyi supports his insistence that mind and body are inseparable by pointing to the way we know, think, and discover, relying upon tacit elements in those processes. And the tacit elements require a body and a context. So, the conclusion, all knowledge falls into one of these two classes. It is either tacit or rooted in tacit knowledge. If that's true, then the Cartesians who admit the tacit but ignore it are ignoring the major part of what they're trying to study. Olavo told me, let me bring this in right here. I think you probably already know about Ferdinand de Saussure's work. He was apparently the father of the linguistic Cartesian tradition ideas that we're dealing with now. Apparently, as a result of de Saussure and his followers, we have three understandings of the word. There is the significance. I've spoken of this before. There is the meaning. And there's the reference. The reference is the thing it refers to. So the reference of pen is this thing. The meaning of pen is an instrument for writing that contains ink. And I'm not sure what the significance is. But, according to Olavo, the Cartesian linguists consider that reference doesn't matter. They only care in language about significance and meaning. They study language. They say that the meaning of a word is in its difference from all other words. The reference doesn't matter. Meaning is all relational. And they study language as a closed system. And it doesn't work at all. It distorts language and makes it meaningless. So, that's what Olavo was saying about this. Okay, let me continue. Alright, I'm going to begin with the quote in the middle that we ended with the last bit. All knowledge falls into one of these two classes. It is either tacit or rooted in tacit knowledge. The ideal of a strictly explicit knowledge is indeed self-contradictory. Deprived of their tacit coefficients, all spoken words, all formulae, all maps and graphs are strictly meaningless. An exact mathematical theory means nothing unless we recognize an inexact non-mathematical knowledge on which it bears and a person whose judgment upholds this bearing. Some people consider that studying language where you consider significance and meaning only is ideal, and an explicit language is the ideal. Explicit meaning no layers of meaning, only surface meaning. But that robs language of most of its meaning, because most of its meaning is tacit. And Olavo made a joke. He said, with this approach, where you have only significance and meaning, and a word is only defined by its difference from other words, he said you would go into a restaurant and order a piece of pizza, and they could bring you anything which is actually, I don't remember how he constructed this. He said pizza and anything that isn't pizza. Well, I'm sorry. I brought up something. I can't remember how he worked it out. It was really funny when he said it, though. Sorry. Maybe I'll get him to repeat it for me. Okay, let's move on to the next paragraph. Here, for the discipline of thought I am contending for, the effective recognition of it as intellectually and culturally necessary, we have something like an extra literary charter. It is the extra-literary nature of his approach, that of a distinguished scientist whose impelling interest was the nature of scientific discovery, that makes Polanyi so valuable an ally. His realization that mind is always an individual mind, a unique person's, and the mind of a body, has an obvious bearing on the problem, or crux for thought, it is difficult to decide how it should be referred to, that Andreski raises, but most significantly, may be said to be hardly aware he raises, in the passage I shall quote. It is for explicit thought the fundamental challenge that cannot escape being recognized as such by those who make the very different approach to it from Polanyi's. That is my concern here. The approach by way of what should be the literary student's approach to language. Here's the passage. Okay, let's start at the beginning here. Here, for the discipline of thought I am contending for, the effective recognition of it as intellectually and culturally necessary, we have something like an extra literary charter. This is another one of those sentences that you have to draw arrows to figure out what he is talking about. Okay, first of all, the word here. That refers to the quote immediately above. The quote immediately above, pointing out that without the tacit element, language is meaningless. That idea is what is referred to by the word here. Here, for the discipline of thought I am contending for. Okay, this entire book so far, in this entire book, Levis has been contending for a disciplined approach to language, which he has not fully explained. I think the reason we can't abandon this reading yet is because we don't really know what he is recommending yet. But there is a disciplined idea of thinking that recognizes the full orb of human possibility. This discipline of thought is what the book has to do with. Okay, so here, for the discipline of thought I am contending for, the effective recognition of it as intellectually and culturally necessary. The word it refers to the discipline of thought. So, this is what I call a rabbit trail. He isn't in the heart of the sentence. So, here, for the discipline of thought, I think that discipline is culturally necessary. Okay, so this phrase, the effective recognition of it as intellectually and culturally necessary, modifies discipline of thought. It's adjectival. So the discipline of thought, which he is contending for, and he is also contending that the world recognize the necessity of this discipline of thought. So really he's contending for two things. So here, for these two things, we have something like an extra literary charter. So the core of the sentence is, here we have something like an extra literary charter for the discipline I'm contending for, and for the fact that it needs to be recognized as necessary intellectually and culturally. That's really important. That's the sense of this sentence. The phrase, effective recognition of it, is just an added effusion. It has nothing to do with the main point of the sentence. It is an added description of discipline of thought, in case we didn't remember how important it was for everybody to recognize this as necessary. So, Here, in this quote by Polanyi, we have something like an extra literary charter for the discipline of thought Levis is contending for. A discipline of thought which is necessary to be recognized by the world. That's that sentence. Moving on. It is the extra literary nature of his approach, that of a distinguished scientist whose impelling interest was the nature of scientific discovery, that makes Polanyi so valuable an ally. An extra literary charter. It's not just English geeks who say literary language is important. It is also scientific geeks, people who are concerned with the nature of knowing, the nature of how we know what we know. A scientist can recognize that the tacit is all around us, and the explicit is like an island in the ocean of tacit knowledge. It's very good to be able to say that it is not just English majors who insist on this, because the world discounts literature as a fluff and ornament anyway to an academic education. So when you get the scientists saying it, it will have some weight. Moving on. His realization, Polanyi's realization, that mind is always an individual mind, a unique person's, and the mind of the body, has an obvious bearing on the problem, or crux for thought, it is difficult to know how it should be referred to, that Andreski raises, but most significantly may be said to be hardly where he raises, in a passage I shall quote. Okay, another complicated sentence. He's getting around to saying this. In a moment, I am about to quote a passage which will exemplify the confusion of thinking that Andreski falls prey to. The problem with Andreski's logic is about to be exemplified in a quote that I am about to quote in a minute. Okay? Let's go to the beginning of the sentence. His realization, Polanyi's, that mind is always an individual mind, a unique person's mind, has an obvious bearing on the problem which is about to be demonstrated through Andreski's quote. Okay, so the problem, we don't know what it is yet. It is about to be demonstrated in a quote we are about to read. So when we read that quote, we will see a problem. And when we see that problem, we can go back to this sentence and think about how Polanyi's realization that mind and body are inseparable has a bearing on this problem. Mind and body inseparable sheds light on the problem Andreski is about to exhibit for us in a quote we're about to read. Okay? I'll just read it again so you get the flow, but it means Polanyi's realization that mind and body are inseparable has a bearing on a problem, a difficulty of the thought process that Andreski tumbles into because he doesn't give due weight to the tacit. He thinks the explicit is enough, and that causes him to make a mistake. We will see it more clearly in light of this mind-body inseparability. Okay, so his realization that mind is always an individual mind, a unique person's in the mind of a body, has an obvious bearing on the problem or crux for thought. It is difficult to decide how it should be referred to. Crux for thought. That means the essential turning point that helps you know whether you're thinking right or thinking wrong. The essential axis, crux for thought, that Andreski raises. Now, Andreski doesn't raise this explicitly. Andreski's bad example raises for us the problem. If Andreski, being an intelligent man, can't do any better with his argument than this, he's got a problem. We will be able to see it. So, a problem that Andreski raises, but more significantly, may be said to be hardly aware he raises. He's not really aware that he's doing something that doesn't look good. In a passage I shall quote. It is, for explicit thought, the fundamental challenge that cannot escape being recognized as such by those who make the very different approach to it from Polanyi's, that is my concern here. The approach by way of what should be the literary student's approach to language. Okay. Okay. This problem is an example of what the problem is for explicit thought, of neglecting most of the meaning of language. When you neglect all the tacit and focus on the explicit, then your explicit thought has a great challenge to overcome. You have created for yourself an obstacle that is the greatest challenge to explicit thought that there is. Okay, so this problem is, for explicit thought, the fundamental challenge that cannot escape being recognized by literary students. So he's saying that Polanyi recognized this problem, Levis recognizes the problem, and the students who study language in the way in which Levis recommends will see this problem clearly. If you cannot see what the problem is, it's possible that your understanding of language is not quite up to Levis's level. Or perhaps your thinking is impaired by the Cartesian pattern of either or. I myself had trouble seeing what Levis was pointing out, and now I see it more clearly after discussing with Olavo. So let's see if you see it. So I'll read the passage and we'll see if you see any problems at all with it. You're looking for a problem with Andreski's logic and his train of argument. You're looking for a problem in his logical flow and his conclusions. See if you can see one. Good luck. Okay, here's the passage. I'm on page 40, reading the quote that was inset. In the old debate about whether the individual is more important than the group, or the other way around, the issues have been obscured by the constant use of the expression, the individual. Because, strictly speaking, there is no such thing as the individual, but only many individuals. An equally careless hypostatization underlies the frequently repeated cliché about man being able to control his future, often phrased as a rhetorical question. For as soon as we ask, who is man, we see that he does not exist, and there are only men and women with varied and largely incompatible sentiments, dispositions, and aims. No doubt they could control many things if they would only agree, but they do not. Therefore, to speak of man deciding or controlling is nonsense. Once we get rid of this linguistic mirage, we can see that the liberal philosophical individualists were true collectivists in the sense of defending the interests of many individuals, as opposed to the prerogative of the powerful few. Okay, let's talk. Oh, first of all, maybe I'll give you a moment. Let me give you a moment and give you a chance to write a chat or a quick email suggesting any problem you may see. Don't look ahead. If you have already read Levis's next paragraph, don't respond. But I'll give you just a minute to write an idea of what may be the problem here. See what you say. I'm going to take a brief break while I wait for you. Do we have any responses, Alessandra?
Okay, we have one question, but I don't think it relates to what you're saying. I'm not sure if even if I understand what the student means by her question, but she says, well, when we go to the discovering part of the text, then the person is the beginning of understanding. Is that tacit knowledge? I'm not sure if. And other than that, we don't have many other comments.
Okay, we have a question that Alessandro and I are not sure we understand, but I'll read it to you. I'll ask him to read it and I'll pass it on. Could you say it again?
Mm-hmm. When we go to the discovering part of the text.
When we go to the discovering part of the text.
Then the person is the beginning of understanding.
Then the person is the beginning of understanding.
Is that tacit knowledge?
Is that tacit knowledge? I'm not sure what you mean by the discovering part of the text, and I'm not sure what you mean by the person is the beginning of knowledge. So if you would like to clarify, we'll continue that discussion. But for right now, I'm going to move on with this, because if you want, we'll break up and take your clarification when it comes, because it takes a few minutes for you to hear me, and then a few minutes for me to receive your response. So it's not instant, okay? So I'm going to move on with this for now. And I assume that none of you can see what Levis is about to point out. Let me talk a little bit about a bit of vocabulary, and also a little bit about what this quote evoked in me. First, a little bit of vocabulary. The word hypostatization, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, means to treat something abstract as though it were real. And to say that is man in charge of his destiny? Or is mankind capable of protecting the environment? Or something like that. He is saying that to use man is a hypostatization, because there's no such thing as man as though he were a concrete individual who could do something. There are only many men. And a rhetorical question is one that is not intended to be answered. Usually it is a question that is asked in order to make a point. For instance, if you were to say, let's see, the frequently repeated cliche about man being able to control his future, often phrased as a rhetorical question. Can man control his future? And perhaps the answer would be no, or yes. But in any case, man doesn't exist according to this because there are only men. So when I read this quote, I thought what Andreski was saying was very sharp, very smart, very commonsensical, because there was a book I read when I was in college, written by C.S. Lewis, who was a contemporary of Levis. They both were professors in the same place at the same time. So they probably knew each other. And it's possible that Lewis read this piece by Andreski. Anyway, in the book by C.S. Lewis, he talked about how certain political parties say that man must control his own destiny. And Lewis pointed out that that really means a few men are going to control the other men. And that no one speaks for man. Really, it is a few who are functioning as an oligarchy, ruled by a few, in the name of everyone else. So when I read it, I thought, yes, that's right. There is no such thing as man, only men. Can you hear the difference between that? When I say, there is no such thing as man, only men. Man, men. That's a vocalization that many internationals can't hear. The difference between man and men. Man, men. man. So, when someone says, there's no such thing as man, only men, that kind of thrills me because it evokes something I read in C.S. Lewis 20 years ago and really liked. But let's move on and see what Levis has to say about this quote. Remember, one page ago, Levis says, Polanyi's realization that mind is always an individual mind, skip some stuff, has obvious bearing on the problem for thought that Andreski raises, or is hardly aware he raises, in a passage I shall quote. So remember, this passage is a demonstration of a problem that comes about when you separate mind from body. Let's see what Levis says about it. Beginning in the paragraph with the words, "This illustrates very usefully," page 40. This illustrates very usefully the danger inseparable from Andreski's necessary common sense. The strong common sense is necessary to his function of exposing the follies, fatuities, and pretensions of social science and social studies. To say this is to grant implicitly that the disciplined robustness of mind and purpose, with the command of knowledge that accompanies it, has, in the study of civilized society, or civilization being what it is, a respectable positive function. But the quoted passage demonstrates that when the standards that make it respectable prevail, the danger remains and is, in fact, accentuated. For the common sense spirit, reinforced by the insidious half-assurance that it has acquired the authority of science in becoming disciplined, tends to be a good deal worse than not enough, and our cultural habit, which knows of no better guide, desperately needs not confirmation, but the most sharp, disturbing, and insistent of challenges. Let's stop there for a second and make sure we begin to understand what he's saying before we go on, because this is a big chunk. Hold on. Okay, this passage above illustrates very usefully the danger inseparable from Andreski's necessary common sense. The danger refers to, Andreski has fallen into a fault of thought, which we haven't gotten to yet. He's going to point it out in the second half of this paragraph and the next one. Andreski falls into a fault and comes to a false conclusion. The danger for all of us is the danger that we will fall into the same fault, the same error of thinking, if we don't understand the mind-body connection, but allow the dualism of mind and body, of either or. The pattern, the Cartesian pattern of abstracting a piece of something and then dealing with it as though it were the whole, and neglecting to deal with the rest of it. So, the danger is the danger that we will fall into the same flawed logic and false conclusions that Andreski is falling into here if we follow his footsteps with his Cartesian patterns. That's the danger. And the danger is inseparable from Andreski's necessary common sense. So there is a theme in this paragraph that the common sense is good, but the common sense itself increases the danger of falling into the pit that Andreski has fallen into. The more strong your common sense, the more likely you are to fall into this particular error. This is an error which is more common among those who are disciplined from a point of view of common sense. That's kind of bad. Too bad, huh? So, this passage illustrates very usefully the danger inseparable from Andreski's necessary common sense. We need the common sense, but it carries along with it the danger. The strong common sense is necessary to his function, Andreski's function, of exposing the follies, fatuities, and pretensions of social science and social studies. Okay, everyone knows what folly is. Folly is foolishness. Fatuity is complacent foolishness. In other words, it's foolishness that feels good about itself. It's foolishness that has no shame because it is unaware of its nakedness. It is unembarrassed foolishness, is fatuity. So you see people in literature coming into a comic figure, coming in all puffed up and spouting off foolishness, thinking he sounds intelligent. That's fatuity. And pretension. That is another step on this comic character. The comic character walks in. He is foolish. He is proud of himself because he is unaware that he is foolish. And because he thinks he is high and smart and sophisticated, he takes to himself dignity that is not his own. He takes to himself privilege. He assumes people admire him. That is pretension. So, Andreski is exposing, making explicit the folly, fatuity, and pretension of his colleagues, the social scientists, and of social science itself. Exposing the folly, exposing the fatuity, and exposing the pretension. And in order to do that, his common sense is a necessary component. It is a necessary component. To say this, to say that common sense is necessary and exposing the folly is good, is to grant implicitly that the disciplined robustness of mind and purpose, with the command of knowledge that accompanies it, has, in the study of civilized society, civilization being what it is, a respectable positive function. Okay. To say this, the previous sentence, is to grant. Now, to grant is to concede, to make a concession. Generally, we make concessions when we are in a battle that is against something, but we feel we need to give a little in order to gain a point. That's what grant. Granted, you would say, I could say to Andreski, granted, your disciplined robustness of mind has a place in studying our culture being what it is. But it will always be followed with, but, and then I criticize. So, granted, Mr. and Professor Andreski, your common sense has a place in studying culture, culture being what it is. But it is not enough. Okay, that's what's being said. To say this is to grant implicitly that the disciplined robustness of mind and purpose that Andreski holds. So Andreski has disciplined robustness of mind and purpose, with the command of knowledge that accompanies it. So he's also granting that Andreski is knowledgeable and has a good common sense mind and good purpose. Granting all that. It is to say that all this has a place, has a respectable positive function in the study of civilized society, our civilization being what it is. So, it's good that Andreski has robust, disciplined common sense and a good command of knowledge, as he is exposing the folly of social science, and it is good to study our culture this way, our culture being what it is. But, moving on, the quoted passage demonstrates that when the standards that make it respectable prevail, the danger remains and is in fact accentuated. When the standards that make it respectable, make what respectable? The study of our culture. It's respectable to study our culture, our civilization, if you do so with disciplined common sense and a good command of knowledge. But when you study it in this way, the danger of falling into a certain kind of error not only remains, but it is accentuated. So your common sense, far from solving the danger or averting the danger, actually accentuates it. The common sense itself becomes a risk factor. A risk factor. Making you more likely to fall into a certain kind of intellectual error. Okay? Moving on. For the common sense spirit, reinforced by the insidious, that's a negative word, things that are insidious are never good, the insidious half-assurance that it has acquired the authority of science in becoming disciplined. So you've got common sense reinforced by the insidious idea that I have become, common sense has become scientific. It has gained authority by becoming disciplined. In our culture, we are accustomed to accept the findings of science as correct and factual. If someone puts on an experiment which he designs properly and he is able to repeat over and over again, and he receives certain results, those results are taken to be true. Now, if someone, without doing the experiment, looked at the question and applied his common sense, he might say, for example, maybe the experiment is when you combine baking soda with vinegar, will it release gas and foam and possibly explode? Okay. Well, someone looking at the powder and looking at the vinegar and applying their common sense might say, well, if you pour the vinegar over the powder, it probably won't do anything, because I've poured vinegar over lots of powders, flour, whatever, it never does anything. So I think nothing will happen. That's my common sense. Then you do the experiment and you repeat it over and over, and you find that it, dramatically expands, it can explode, it foams, it releases gas. So you have a scientific finding and you have a common sense finding. The scientific finding will have more weight because it is backed up by experiment. The common sense finding may seem right until you bring the rigors of scientific experimentation to bear upon the question. So, common sense does not have the authority of science. However, here we have a common sense spirit reinforced by the idea that it has acquired the authority of science because it has become disciplined. So we have Andreski acting as though his common sense critique of the sociologists and his common sense approach to the questions in this excerpt, he assumes this common sense approach has the authority of science because it has become disciplined. Well, that causes him to become pretentious. He is taking upon himself a dignity which is not his, the dignity of having proven things through rigorous experimentation. He's not done that. He's only brought a more rigorous common sense to the table than his colleagues perhaps brought, at least in his own opinion. So that's the force of this sentence. For the common sense spirit, reinforced by the insidious half-assurance that it has acquired the authority of science in becoming disciplined, by becoming disciplined, tends to be a good deal worse than not enough. Okay. Tends to be, remember I said tends to be means in most cases it will be. A good deal worse than not enough. Now what he was going to say is, bringing common sense to bear on the question referenced in the excerpt above, the question of whether the individual is more important than the group or the group is more important than the individual. Bringing common sense to this is not enough. Andreski brought common sense to it, pointing out the bit that the individual doesn't exist, or the group doesn't exist, or something linguistic like that. He pointed out a linguistic mirage. A hypothesization. Hypothesis, I can't say the word. But, according to Levis, that was not enough. In fact, it was a good deal worse than not enough, because not only was it not enough to clarify the issue, it actually shot him in a wrong direction, leading him to a different wrong conclusion. So in a sense it does more harm than good, the common sense spirit by itself. So, tends to be a good deal worse than not enough. And our cultural habit of common sense approach, that's what the cultural habit is, of relying on common sense. Our cultural habit, which knows no better guide than common sense, desperately needs not confirmation. Our cultural habit of relying on common sense does not need to be confirmed because it's wrong, but rather it needs the most sharp, disturbing, and insistent of challenges. So he's saying the common sense spirit, which Andreski has and which is our cultural habit, needs not to become complacent, needs not to confirm itself and say, yes, You're smarter than the rest of them. You're right and they're wrong. Good job. Instead of that, it needs to be challenged. And Levis is about to challenge it. Okay? It needs the most sharp, disturbing, and insistent of challenges. Because it's becoming complacent. And Andreski is actually fatuous when he claims his conclusions in this excerpt and the part that follows. Okay, now we will move on to the next part of this paragraph. It is revealing how confidently Andreski reduces the issues to the futility of the old debate. For his way of exposing the old futility is to present us, in his own terms, with what is essentially the same thing. What is futile is his offer of logical cogency. But what that offer actually represents is an endorsement of a discouraging reality. A discouraging actuality. The reign of reductive common sense, which says, once we get rid of this linguistic mirage, we can see that the liberal philosophical individualists were true collectivists in the sense of defending the interests of many individuals, as opposed to the prerogative of the powerful few, whereas ... collectivist ideologies ... Okay. It is revealing how confidently Andreski reduces the issues to the futility of the old debate. The characteristic of this Cartesian tradition is reductionism. Reductionism is simplifying a complex issue so much that you actually distort it. Andreski reduces the issues, the linguistic issue, to the futility of the old debate. The old debate being whether the individual is more important than the group or the group is more important than the individual. But his way, it says, it is revealing how confidently Andreski reduces this because, or for, his way of exposing the old futility is to present us, in his own terms, with something that's essentially the same thing. This is where I had a question. I didn't really understand how Andreski's substitute was the same thing. But I understand it now after talking to Aula, and I'll get to it soon. Basically, it's the same thing because he is substituting the liberal philosophical individualists were true collectivists in the sense of defending the interests of many individuals, as opposed to the prerogative of the powerful few. Apparently, he's falling into a similar linguistic problem right there as the people above with their hypostatization. Okay, let's just keep reading. What is futile is his offer of logical cogency. Okay. What he is trying to do is he is trying to use explicit language to demystify this argument about whether the individual is more important than the group. He is trying to point out that explicitly speaking, the individual doesn't exist. So, the individual cannot be more important than the group because there is no collective individual. So he is trying to show that if someone simply understood language more explicitly, they would have a clearer understanding. And he points out this clear understanding using language explicitly in the end with his discussion of the liberal philosophical individualists. But Levis sees that he is doing the same thing when he starts calling the philosophical individualists collectivists. He's again in his either or. Well, if they're not individualists, they must be collectivists. And in fact, in the next paragraph, we're going to see that it all comes back to the same kind of repression, the same kind of confusion, the same. Every strategy boils down to a few people controlling the rest. Whether you call it in the interests of the group, whether you call it in the interests of the individual, whether you call yourself a liberal philosophical individualist, or whether you call yourself a collectivist. All of it means a system of control and order in society by which a few people control the rest of them. So Andreski himself cannot see that what he is substituting is exactly the same thing as what he is debunking. He can't see it because of his Cartesian certitude of either or. And it is futile to try to clarify complex realities by making your language more explicit. What you must do is bring in the tacit so that people can understand with their heart and their intuition and see through all of these linguistic mirages. So what is futile is Andreski's attempt to correct a problem by doing the very same thing. To correct a problem with more of the same. Kind of like the public school system in America. They throw a lot of money at it and it fails. So they throw more money at it. Never seeing that not changing the approach, they will not get a different outcome. Andreski can't see that. So, reading again, what is futile is his offer of logical cogency. It is impossible to get logical cogency in the way he is going for the explicit language. But what that offer actually represents is an endorsement of a discouraging reality. An endorsement is a statement that reinforces and supports something. So his offer actually proves a discouraging actuality. Far from offering hope, it actually encourages discouragement. It leads you to see a discouraging reality. The discouraging reality is this: the reign of reductive common sense. So, if Andreski himself, while debunking the pretensions of his colleagues, still stumbles into the same fault that they are falling into, then reductive common sense is never going to solve the problems for thought that our society struggles with. That is the discouraging actuality. The reign of reductive common sense. Illustrated by the quote, once we get rid of this linguistic mirage, we can see that the liberal philosophical individualists were true collectivists in the sense of defending the interests of many individuals, as opposed to the prerogative of the powerful few. whereas ... collectivist ideologies ... Okay, I think we should stop there because it's time and we're getting into a whole lot more in the next paragraph. So if you have any questions, will you send them to us now? And I'll be back in 5 minutes to close the class if you don't have questions. So send me some feedback. Okay, we have some feedback, some questions, so let's let Alessandro read them to me.
Okay. The first question there's a discussion about the fact that Andreski denies the existence of quote-unquote the individual. It seems that one of the students don't understand exactly what he means when he denies the existence of the individual.
Okay, one of the students has asked, what does Andreski mean when he denies the existence of the individual? If I write a sentence that includes this, the individual loved my soup, my recipe for soup. I'm referring to a person, a specific human being who liked my soup. If I write a sentence like this, the individual isn't able to see clearly. The fact that I capitalized the word individual means I am not referring to a specific human being, perhaps a blind person. No, I am not referring to a specific individual that actually exists. But I am talking about a theoretical group of individuals, but not even a group of individuals. I am talking about any individual man, every individual man. So what I am saying here is I am referring to a concept of individual human being. And in that sense, no actual flesh and blood representative equals exactly this. This has no reference. It is a theoretical construct. So when Andreski says the individual doesn't exist, he means there is no living, breathing person that represents this person. There is only lots and lots of people, individuals, human beings, each of which is different, none of which conforms exactly to this ideal model. In other words, there is no representative individual. There is only lots and lots of different ones. So that's what he means when he says the individual doesn't exist. Are there any other questions, and is that good enough?
Mm-hmm. One student tried to answer this question and ended up asking another question. So he said, if the individual doesn't exist, so there is no individual thought. There is only collective thought for Andreski. Hence, this is a hypostatization, isn't it?
Okay, here's a comment, continuing with the flow of this question. If the individual doesn't exist for Andreski, then there is no individual thought, only collective thought. Isn't this a hypostatization? Personally, how I would interact with that comment, I would say that you're using, perhaps could be using the word, you really need to clarify how you're using the word, because for Andreski, he would say the individual doesn't exist. There are only individuals with their own individual thought. So he would then say, there's not even any collective thought. He would say, since the individual doesn't exist, there isn't one collective thought. I think Andreski would say there is individual thought, but there is not collective thought. And I agree, it is a hypostasis. The whole thing is filled with hypostatization. I think you can meaningfully talk about the individual, and you can meaningfully talk about collective thought. That's my opinion.
Okay. And last question is not about this text. It's an English, it's a grammar related question. The student says, Margarita, today I watched an English lesson on the internet, not yours, in which I read the following phrase, quote, did you ever travel by plane, unquote. I asked the English teacher if the grammatical construction of this question was right, and if it would not be the case of using the present perfect. And he said both present perfect and past simple are correct in that situation. The only difference, he said, is that in the present perfect, travel becomes traveled. Is that correct? I'm lost here.
You would say, have you ever traveled by plane?
Yes.
Did you ever travel by plane? Have you ever traveled by plane? They're definitely both correct. The did you ever travel by plane is more likely to be used in conversation. Have you ever traveled by plane is something I would more expect to see in print. But it's more formal language. But did you ever travel by plane is more colloquial, more informal. But both of them are correct. Did you ever travel? Have you ever traveled? Does that answer the question?
I think it answers. Maybe you should you could comment a little bit on the difference between past simple and present perfect tense. In the sense that when someone uses the present perfect tense, what exactly the person is implying by choosing the present perfect tense instead of the past simple tense?
Alessandro is suggesting that I comment on why a person would choose the present perfect as opposed to the simple past, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have to confess that it is difficult for me to talk in terms of grammatical constructions. It's easier for me if examples are given of these. So let me ask Alessandro again. Can you give me an example of two sentences, and I can say why you might choose one or the other that are in these?
For example, well, we could. You said that this question, for instance, did you ever travel by train? It is commonly simple past, and it's commonly used in oral speech and everyday conversation. Whereas, have you ever traveled by train? It's probably grammatically more. It's correct in terms of grammatics, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of grammar. Maybe you could explain why is it more correct?
Alessandro is asking me why is one more correct or more formal than the other, but I don't know. The truth is, in English, we have so many possibilities and so many choices, and it's just something you catch. We catch, and we don't study it carefully enough to be able to reduce it that way. So I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that both of those are fine.
Okay.
They're options.
Okay. So let's see if I have some other question here. That's it, Margarita.
Okay, that'll be it for today. Keep watching the website for more information about studying in the United States. I am working on a frequently asked questions document, which will give a lot more information. So if you have specific questions, send them to me and I'll put out answers.